the public doesn't know. That's why you need to stay tuned to the end of this interview. We're going to talk about California and their big pension dry up and their inability to fund these governments that are bloated, yes, but which have reserve capital no one knows about. That is plenty to deal with the issue. That's with Carl Herman later in the broadcast. But finally, in the economic fold tonight, we have the big banks crafting living wills in case they fail. And Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan is telling us this will help the cost to taxpayers. This will allow banks to fail without it falling on the public. Well, we don't know if that's true, but they're saying these measures could be basically equivalent to reinstating Glass-Steagall, which they should probably do anyway. You've got Sheila Bair also backing the issue, and on the surface, it is the system, the regulatory agencies of the government forcing the big banks to basically set the architecture for decoupling, setting aside the normal day-to-day investments of people's accounts that should grow at a regular rate from the crazy speculation and the underwriting and all the other private equity stuff that really has caused all the derivatives problems, triggering the larger economic collapse. It's, of course, very complicated, but they've got the biggest banks here: JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, among others, being forced by the Federal Reserve and the FDIC to create these living wills for their liquidation, for the liquidation of the company. So we'll see. This is supposedly the solution under the Frank-Dodd Act. Instead of restating the Glass-Steagall Act, this is their model for liquidating these banks and saving the public. We'll see if it works. Something tells me not to hold my breath. Anyway, we're going to turn now to a special whistleblower report from the 7/7 bombings. Our reporter Patrick Henningsen got this exclusive interview. Very interesting topic. We'll go to that now, come back with more news, but stay tuned. It's a big program tonight. This is the INFOWARS Nightly News.
London 7/7, the terror event that changed the course of European domestic security policy. A devastating attack which hit underground trains and buses. It was both bold and brilliant in its execution. The official narrative is that of 4 radical British Muslims whose perfectly planned and run operation claimed the lives of some 52 innocent victims. In 2010, while compiling an annual strategic threat assessment, South Yorkshire Police's principal intelligence analyst Tony Farrell learned that the government narrative of Islamic extremists carrying out the attacks of both 9/11 and 7/7 was a lie, perpetrated by a mainstream media code of silence and complicit government officials, a stance which ultimately led to his dismissal. INFOWARS.com had a chance to speak with Mr. Farrell at a recent Employment Tribunal appeal hearing in London, where he sheds additional light on his pending case.
My name's Tony Farrell. I work for South Yorkshire, or used to work for South Yorkshire Police as the principal intelligence analyst, and worked for them for 17 years. And in September 2010, following a stance in July 2010 on the 5th anniversary of the London bombings, I made a stance that led to my dismissal. My stance was, when tasked to do a strategic threat assessment, which incorporated, amongst other things, the threat from counter-terrorism, in the light of the realisation that 9/11 and 7/7 were not as the government narratives would have us believe, I no longer was able to say that the threat was coming from Islamic extremism, as the government rhetoric was saying at that point, and my managers in South Yorkshire Police wanted me to say. I felt that would be discriminatory against the Muslim communities in South Yorkshire and further afield. And I went to my boss, alerting him to the fact that there is all sorts of information available in open source, including the work that Alex Jones had done to expose this at the time. That was influential indeed. And they clamped down on me, refused to contemplate the notion of the threat being anything other than Islamic extremism. saying, you and I, Tony, are just the government foot soldiers. You'll never get the government to tell the truth. So they weren't saying you're wrong, Tony. They were just saying, go along with the lie and say that the threat's from Islamic terrorism. They tried to get me down to occupational health. Now, for the day, I went along with it. But on the 8th of July, I went into work, and that was the day of the assignment. And the realisation had only happened about a week or two before this. I'd given them a red alert. They ignored it. They were cornering me. Now, I felt as though now I either had to lie and say that the threat was something that my analysis pointed towards was different. I couldn't lie in that situation, the professional standards for honesty, integrity, etc. So at that point, on the morning of the 8th of July, I made an absurd strategic threat assessment matrix because I was cornered into lying, and I thrust a threat assessment matrix in front of the boss saying 9/11 truth, 7/7 truth, and other aspects of criminality that South Yorkshire Police might be interested in. I just put as irrelevant and scored it up. It was ludicrous, but it was to reflect the absurdity of the situation that were putting me into and cornering me into lying, and lying against the Muslim population in the United Kingdom, where in the light of the government's contest strategy, the government counter-terrorism strategy, rich picture, the police forces in England and Wales and the communities were being encouraged to collect intelligence on Muslims, targeting mosques, targeting universities. Now, that's all well and good if there is a threat there, but in the light of 9/11 and 7/7 and other miscarriages of justice that I was alert to at that point, I thought, well, without proofs, I can't say that. That is really being discriminatory to my Muslim brothers and sisters. And the threat almost certainly was coming from within, in whatever capacity. Now, I didn't know clearly how it had been perpetrated, which agents of the state, but what I did know for certain was that the government narrative, the 9/11 Commission report, and the Home Office anonymous document, official document, was just a pack of lies. No other word for it. It was just ludicrous. So in the light of that, I made the stance, knowing full well that it's likely to end in tears. It's likely to end in dismissal. But my conscience said, take it, Tony, rather than prostitute yourself. So they wanted to sort of treat it as if I was insane. So they tried to cart me off to occupational health. At first I resisted, but I did go to occupational health, came back with a clean bill of health. I then went to a dismissal hearing in September, and I challenged them to do something about this and let me give the strategic assessment fully to source everything up, to say why I was more than justified in doing what I did. They didn't want to know and said, your beliefs may well be correct. You've had exemplary record for South Yorkshire Police, excellent work, but it's incompatible with where we are at the moment. So it was a very sad occasion, we're sacking you. By the way, you can appeal. I did appeal to the police authority, who just rubber stamped the deal and said, Tony Farrell's views, this was a councillor, Tony Farrell's views are outlandish. Nobody investigated it, outlandish. So then it went into a more formal footing, employment tribunal. I sought my legal advice, and they said best to argue on a discrimination on grounds of your religious philosophical beliefs, which is an unusual thing to do. Unfortunately for me, I went with it because I had said that, look, if you're asking me what a threat is, it's a satanic New World Order. But I would have never have said that had I not disbelieved 9/11 and 7/7. And he said, that's religious philosophical to some degree. So I was steered down that route, and we had the pre-hearing in the tribunal to discuss whether that belief was a philosophical belief, because if it was, it would have been protected. But the judge, in a way correctly, diagnosed it as, well, look, that wasn't the cause of the blockage. It was the fact that 9/11, he disbelieved 9/11, he disbelieved 7/7 based on empirical data rather than a philosophical belief. Right? So it was dismissed on those grounds. It left me an unfair dismissal. Could they have redeployed? Was it reasonable to sack me? And in September, 3 days in September 2011, in a hearing with Ian O'Crane representing me as a lay representative, I'd run out of all resources to have legal representation. I lost an unfair dismissal hearing as well. Now we have a course for appeal. We did appeal, and the judge dismissed it with no reasonable prospects of success. But there is a rule in the Employment Appeal Tribunal which we've taken advantage of to get us to court today. So sat ex parte, i.e. on my own in front of the judge, South Yorkshire Police not present, the argument was really to say I was making, it wasn't a religious belief, it was a Public Interest Disclosure Act. It was a protected disclosure. I, as the intelligence analyst, had been tasked to do the analysis, and they shouldn't have sacked me just because they didn't like the analysis. I was speaking truth to power. Right? Not the truth that they wanted me to hear, they're enabling the one truth, but what I considered as the analyst, being tasked to do the threat assessment, as the truth, to the best of my knowledge. So I put an inference on it. I didn't say it was dead certain. I said the inference being that it was almost certainly an inside job, 95% in the UK, 99% in America with the 9/11. So I also said that the matrix system of threat assessment, and my first degree is statistics, was a ludicrous attempt by the government, National Police Improvement Agency, to almost mind control and dumb down thinking, criminal intelligence analysis thinking, on looking at threat. Why would they do that? Well, the construct that they had within the matrix was artificial and deliberately heightened the fear coming from Islamic extremism and the terror attack. So JTAC, Joint Terrorist Analysis Centre, always put out the threat levels as almost imminent, high or severe. Now, in a crude scoring system, that had to be transferred locally, irrespective of what intelligence you had locally. And potentially the harm a terrorist act could do, well, it's how far will the imagination stretch? You know, it could be anything. So the consequence, the harm, the probability, all meant that resources were being allocated to unaccountable resources within Special Branch and within MI5, right? But without the intelligence and the evidence to back it up. And in the light of 9/11/77, not squaring with the official accounts, I felt I had to make a stance on the strategic threat assessment. Said it was totally ludicrous. I'd always thought that anyway, but in the light of that, I thought enough no more, that's where I make the stance on the strategic threat. Now, that was why I was in the court today, arguing that it wasn't really a religious philosophical belief. We agree with that. There's no point of issue with the police. You know, there's no facts that we differ on, other than we are saying that as an analyst I was making a protected disclosure. I was doing my job. I had a duty of care to present the truth. Now, they didn't have to accept the truth, but just because they didn't like the analysis on the threat, was it reasonable for them to dismiss me? Now, if you're suppressing strategic analysis in that way, because an intelligence analysis is an evolving process whereby you give your intelligence and your intelligence